Okay, so let's go ahead and see a quick overview of how do you cluster two standalone instances of JBoss. Now remember, this is a quick view. We're not going to go in depth into it. This is especially for tomorrow's interview's purpose. All right. So now, first of all, when you're setting up a cluster, we are actually setting up a cluster of two nodes here, isn't it? So what we have is, let's say this is one JBoss instance. This is another JBoss instance. So let's call it node 1 or instance 1, let's say, and let's call this instance 2. Alright, now we know about the ports. This is listening on 8080, then for regular these things, 8G09 for AJP, then 9990 for web console, 9999 for CLI. And now we have to set up another instance, all right, here with a different set of ports. Obviously, let's say we are using 8181 here, 8109 here, 9991, put something 9998. So we will see how to set up this different set of ports for the second instance in a while. But let's just say that you're able to bring up two instances of JBoss, right, one after the other. Now, to make them into a cluster, all right, so these two instances need to communicate with each other. Once they communicate, the session replication happens. So the communication is what you need to establish first. The second thing is the replication is what you need to establish. Now those two things are actually done using JGroup. JGroup is a concept which allows these two servers to communicate each other. So what you're sending is basically you're setting up JGroup. A second thing is you have to set up InfiniSpan is a product that does the clustering, HTTP session replication, sorry. The replication is actually done by InfiniSpan. The JGroups is what allows the communication. So to set up a JBoss cluster, the first thing you need to do is you should enable these two things, JGroups and InfiniSpan. So there is nothing like you have to set up all these things manually. These things were already set up in an XML file. All that you have to do is, till now you are using standalone.xml. Alright, now instead of editing standalone.xml and adding all these things, what you have to do is use a different XML file that comes with JBoss. It's standalone-ha.xml. The HA refers to the high availability. So you have to start both these servers with standalone ha.xml. So this is what the setup is. JBoss cluster setup. Step 1, start the instance as with standalone-ha.xml profile. It's called a profile. So when we know that profile is a group of subsystems. Now if you compare the standalone.xml and standalone ha.xml files, you will see that the ha.xml file has information about all these things. The configurations are already done. There's nothing you have to do. All the second thing now is point 2 is set up JGroup. JGroup allows reliable messaging between cluster members. So basically you are putting these two guys into a cluster, and the JGroup subsystem allows reliable messaging. The same profile, InfiniSpan is an actual product earlier, open source one for high availability. So InfiniSpan provides replication or session replication. There are nothing like replication groups, all that stuff here. You have only replication for now. All right. So your cluster setup actually is pretty much done. Then deploy the application to all JBoss instances. That's it. These are the 4 steps of cluster setup. All right. Now it's not done yet. The reason is you have set up the backend, but a cluster essentially requires a front end which can distribute the request to the backend. So every JBoss cluster or every discussion of JBoss cluster is not complete without having a Apache load balancer in the front end. Now obviously we know that Apache does not have the load balancing. Now when we set up or when we integrate Apache with WebLogic, we use mod_wl.so. The same way here also, this Apache has to be integrated with the backend JBoss EAP servers. Now for that one, you have not just 3 plugins. So 3 plugins you have. One is mod_proxy. The second one is mod JK, and the latest and the most advanced is mod_cluster. So these 3 are the modules that can be integrated with Apache server to redirect the request. So you can have only one of these 3 you will have. You can have mod proxy, mod JK, mod cluster. So the latest one is mod cluster. So the mod cluster basically redirects the request to the backend server. Now the mod cluster is much ahead of the WebLogic way of distribution. We don't know, for some reason the mod_wl.so that we use in WebLogic is not as robust as mod cluster. So the next step of completing this setting up the cluster is to basically set up mod_cluster to load balance the incoming request. These are the 5 steps of setting a JBoss cluster. Now I'm not going to get too deep into it at this point of time. It's little time consuming, so I'll stop it here for today. For this session, and we'll get into another thing. So for now, it's just for interviews. So you'll simply say that you set up 2 instances, then both the instances should be started with standalone HA profile. Then in the standalone HA profile, you set up JGroups, which is already there. InfiniSpan is already there. So all that you have to do is step 1, is what you do. You start the server with HA profile. Then step 4 is what you do. You deploy the WAR file. Then step 5 is what you do. All these things together we'll have to do in another session, but for now that's what is a general idea. So you said instance 1, instance 2, Apache. Now the easier way would be for your interviews, you can simply say, instead of saying that you have to start servers on a different ports, you simply say that they both are on two different boxes. Now the moment you say they both are on two different boxes, you can still use the same port numbers because the lesson address will be same, will be different. So you can say on box 1 we have instance 1, so which is 192.168.128.6. On box 2 we have instance 2, 192.168.128.7. So that way your port numbers will still be same. Alright, so for now those are your steps for clustering. Now I want to talk about the standalone versus domain mode, as I was telling you about. The standalone mode is what was there till now. The domain mode was introduced in AS7. So we will talk a little bit about the domain mode and how is it different. But in the interviews, just say that you're not using domain mode at this point of time, but you know the concept. Now let's see how the domain mode works. The domain mode, the reason why the domain mode was introduced is for administrative easiness. Means if there are too many standalone instances, it's getting difficult even to deploy an application. Let's say there are 10 standalone instances, and if you want to deploy a encode.it.var file, you have to copy that var file into all the 10 instances and then do the general process. You either use a marker file or WebLogic console, JBoss console or anything. So it is difficult to manage large number of instances without a centralized control. Now that problem is actually reduced or eliminated by introducing a domain mode. A domain mode is basically centralized control, centralized configuration, and centralized control. That's what the domain is. Now, as we know in WebLogic, a domain is basically a logical group of servers. So you have JBoss instances. These are all JVMs, just like managed servers. They can have any number of managed servers. Alright, but we don't have anything called an admin server here. Instead, what we have here is a process controller. So you have a process controller. The process controller is the one that controls all these processes. Also, it does not do it directly. It actually interacts with another process called host controller. This is called instance 1, instance 2, like this. Alright, so the process controller actually controls the host controller and this thing, and host controller communicates with instances and in turn communicates with process controller. Now this is one box, let's say. Now just like WebLogic, JBoss domain also can extend to multiple boxes. So a domain mode allows controlling of instances on multiple boxes. So this is another box. Here also you can have instances, other instances. So you will have instance 2.1, just like logic, instance 2.2. The naming conventions can be same. Now here also you will have a host controller. Alright, then you will have a process controller. Alright, the process controller is basically control the instances. Once if the instance goes down, it will try to bring it up. A host controller is for configuration and deployment distribution. Means if you, let's say, deploy an application, the host controller will actually distribute the application. So process controller this is for starting, stopping instances, whereas host controller is for distributing configuration changes and deployments. Right, so this is a JBoss domain. Now when you have host controller, we know that host controller is the guy which actually distributes the deployment. Now one of these two host controllers, or any number of host controllers, one of these two, either this or this, is going to act as a domain controller. So domain controller is nothing but a host controller, but the domain controller actually controls the entire domain using the domain.xml file. So it's the host controller that is talking to another host controller. So you will designate one of these two host controllers as a domain controller. So how you designate it, how you set up such an environment is, we will see it in a different segment, but a simplest setup is each box has a process controller and host controller and instances. One of these boxes is where the control is. That box host controller is also called domain controller. Apart from this, you will see another concept called a server group. A server group is a logical group of servers. So server group is a logical, so you can have any number of server groups and they can be from any box. This is logical. So you can have server group 1, server group 2, like that. So this is a JBoss domain. Domain mode. Now it's little premature to actually get into this thing and do all those things, but it's not that difficult either. So everything that we have done using standalone mode can also be done using domain mode, which means we should be able to deploy an application to all these instances. We should be able to create a data source, make that data source available on all those instances. We should be able to create a cluster and make an application highly available in domain mode. So those things we will see in another session. All right. For now, a domain mode is different from a standalone mode in a sense that it allows centralized control and centralized configuration. The name of the XML file for a domain is domain.xml. The structure is little different. In standalone mode, you have only one instance. But when you want to control multiple instances, you have a host controller and process controller for each box. Domain controller is same as host controller. So when you have a domain across multiple boxes, one of the host controllers is called domain controller, which will actually control the domain.xml. All right. So that's the domain mode, then there are some differences listed out. There is no difference in capability. They are both the same. It's only about administration. One feature that is different is domain mode does not have deployment scanner. So if you are using domain mode, the only way you can deploy an application is through console or using CLI. A standalone mode has only one profile, whereas a domain mode can have multiple profiles. Then there is a server groups in domain mode, centralized control of JVMs in domain mode. Alright. Then this is listing of JBoss versus WebLogic. That also we'll see at a later point of time. But for now, it should give you some idea of what a domain control is. Alright. So that's all.